Hello all, it is me again. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the African Context of Human Rights by Claude Ake. To figure out where Ake is coming from, we need to do a little review of this section. I know we've been reviewing every time, but everything builds on what came before it in this section more than any other. So let's review really quick. Out of the writers we've been talking about, as I said last time, Locke turns out to be the one that is the most influential on, first of all, the United States, and then after that, the other nations of the West. The writings of Locke and sort of Locke's direction with the project started by Hobbes comes to be known sort of broadly as liberalism, or as Ake calls it, Western liberal democracy, right? It turns out to be a whole tradition, a whole movement, global movement it starts out in the West, but soon become a global movement of a certain political attitude, a certain attitude and certain values, certain political values. So let's talk about what liberalism is. First of all, I should give the warning that when we talk about liberals in this sense, we're talking about what are classical liberals, right? And these are people in the tradition of John Locke who believe in things like natural rights, right? Remember, Locke said that we all have a right to life, liberty, and possessions, right? And in liberalism, you emphasize freedom. Remember, Locke thought that we were all fundamentally free, and then if we're going to decide what kind of government is the best to have, we need to understand the initial freedom that all human beings, that is the birthright of all human beings, and that we are fundamentally equal. There are no born kings and no born servants. This tradition of liberalism that comes from Hobbes and Locke, it emphasizes liberty and equality as its most important sort of moral values. And practically on the ground, in terms of political systems, what that means is, what it comes to mean is democracy, right? We talked about how Locke himself was not necessarily a huge partisan of democracy or a modern democracy as we know it. He thought that as long as there was some sort of parliament or Congress in place, the king could serve the purpose of the executive branch of government. In generations after him, particularly after the United States forms, it becomes very popular around the world, or particularly in Europe first, but then around the world, to convert to throw out a lot of the old monarchs and replace it with a republic or a democratic system where the people are represented, right? People vote for representatives, and the representatives go and they do their bidding to establish the branches of government and establish institutions and so on, right? So politically, it means democracy. Liberalism means democracy, and also an important part of liberalism, as it turns out, is capitalism, right? Capitalism is an economic system that's based on private property. It's based on the private ownership of property. So there's not public ownership of property, but I don't need a title. I don't need any governmental permission. I go out, I pay you some money, I acquire then property on my own, right? I buy your house, let's say. Well, I give you, $200,000. You transfer the house to me. Now I own the house. You own my money, right? And now I can do pretty much anything I want with my house. I can rent out the upstairs to college students. I can rent out the whole house. I can fix it up and flip it, right? And then keep all the money for myself. This is sort of the heart and soul of property. People buy and own things themselves, and they don't need the permission of the government, right? So it's taken after Locke that the if you're going to empower people to pick what kind of government they're going to have for themselves to maximize their freedom and maximize their sort of their role in forming the society, that people are naturally going to choose to be free in the marketplace too. And so capitalism tends to go hand in hand with democracy, right? So another important angle we've already talked about, but I want to emphasize it because it's really where Ake picks up, is that an important aspect of this Western liberal democratic tradition is that it emphasizes individual natural rights. That individual people have certain kinds of moral rights, as Locke says, and that these rights are they come to us naturally. We have them simply because we are human beings. And an important part of this is that these rights that we have as individuals and these moral values generally that come along with liberalism, of liberty and democracy and so on, liberalism takes it that these are objective moral values, that they're universal, that given an opportunity, everybody around the world will want to be a free, democratic people and engage in free commerce with one another. So we can see liberalism as a form of what we call moral realism, and the beginning of the class. That it isn't. I mean, maybe it can be finessed into one of the three versions of moral realism that we already talked about. But however you slice it, as it's laid down by Locke anyway, and picked up and exercised by people later on, it is a prime example of moral realism. People take it that these values are what human beings want generally, and that what has worked throughout Europe and in the United States, if people in other places, far off lands, will just give it a chance, our style of government and our style of political values are going to make the world a better place. Everybody wants to be us, right? And if they don't, they just don't understand us, right? So, yes, so this is introduction to Western liberalism. Now, what Ake is going to do for today is he's going to tell us what's wrong with this from this perspective. So let's get the notes up. So, Western liberal democracy. It is from the philosophical tradition from Hobbes and Locke. It emphasizes liberty and equality as its two core values. Everybody is free and everybody is equal. And democracy and capitalism are going to be its two main socioeconomic systems. It's going to emphasize natural rights that are instantiated by individuals. And all these political moral values and these natural rights are intended to be objective and universal. Everybody, they're independent of any one person's preferences, and they apply to everybody everywhere, right? So, if you grew up in the United States, probably even more if you didn't, this probably all sounds very familiar to you. You're familiar with the gist of this, at least. So now let's talk about what Ake thinks is the problem. Okay, so understanding Ake's critique of Western liberalism requires that we have a little bit of quite a bit actually, of historical context. Ake is writing in the 1980s. He is Nigerian, from Nigeria in Africa. And he's writing at a time at the end of the 20th century when Africa is in a process of decolonialization. Decolonialization is the process of undoing colonialism. What do we mean by colonialism? This is normally a question I ask in class, and take hands. You in the back. Yes, that's right. Colonialism was a tradition practiced in Europe going back centuries, back to the times of kings and queens, that when the kings and queens strapped for cash after a while, after, a millennia of running out of money and running out of places to conquer in Europe, they begin to send out boats to go out and find new places, right? Christopher Columbus, for instance, he started a whole trend. So Christopher Columbus goes out, he sails a long, long way away, he eventually runs into land, and then what happens? Well, he sticks a flag in it. He was Italian, but he was sailing for Spain, famously. So he sticks a Spanish flag in the island of Hispaniola, and he says, well, now this belongs to the King of Spain. And anything in this land, gold especially, but also wood, also, people, anything in this land that the king decides that the king wants, the king gets, because this little island is now an annex of the nation of Spain, right? You probably know the story from world history class in high school. What worked for Christopher Columbus soon causes a rush to the New World, and the various countries of Europe begin to send out ships and to come over and to plant flags and things to try to get to all the resources of the New World before the King of Spain steals all the gold, right? Well, what happened in the New World also happens throughout Asia. It happens throughout the Middle East, and of course it happens throughout Africa, right? These various European powers just sail on in, plant a flag in it, and just declare, well, this now belongs to the king of wherever I'm from, right? And what they do this by setting up little colonies, right? This is where the name colonialism comes in, right? The boats go out, they land on the ground, they set up a little colony. This now belongs to the King of Spain, and then the colony gets a little bigger, and eventually you carve out a whole little country that is just, again, an annex of whatever king you came from, right? This leads to lots and lots of problems. I mean, it leads to first of all, it leads to high times if you're the king of Spain or king of one of the European powers. Like I said, they were not in such great shape before Columbus set sail, right? But this reinvigorates the wealth of the monarchs of Europe, right? And changes the world, right? Well, it doesn't work out nearly as well for the people, the indigenous people in the New World, or in Africa, or the Middle East, or in Asia, Australia, or basically anywhere but Europe, right? If you want to, if you're an indigenous person in one of these lands, you need to either get with the program and understand that our king is now your king. And by the way, our religion is now your religion. And you can be cool with this, or this is really an offer you can't refuse. You can be cool with this, or we can, kill you and burn down your country, right? Or find people, indigenous people who will cooperate with us, who we will appoint as part of our, we will put them in charge, right? This goes on, of course, for centuries and centuries. Now, there's a couple ways to describe what happens next. But what happens in the middle part, the early 20th century, and especially the middle part of the 20th century, especially after World War II, is that the European powers, by the way, maintain colonies all over the world up into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, right? So this is not something in the super distant past. This is something that the whole world is really reckoning with just, 100 years ago at tops, some places just a couple decades ago, right? So what happens is, especially after World War II, for reasons, the various colonial powers of the world, among the most important, England, France, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal, Italy, these sorts of places, they begin to decolonialize. That is, they begin to pull their little colonial governments out of the various far-off lands around the world and say, well, look, we're liberal Democrats now. We believe in freedom and equality. We believe that people should rule themselves. And so now you guys get to rule yourselves, right? And what this means is that the European powers pull out and they say, hey, you indigenous people, we're going to leave. And now you're in charge. You set up your government, right? And you can have any government you want, as long as it's Western liberalism, as long as it's democracy and capitalism. So choose anything you want, but it has to be our way. Why is this the case? Well, it's this way for a few reasons. One, the philosophical reason, sort of grand philosophical reason, is, as I've said, there's a tendency on the part of these Western liberals to believe that people everywhere, all people, are just going to be better off. They're going to be more peaceful. They're going to be better educated. They're going to be happier if they just have a democratic form of government and have a political system based on maximizing individual freedom, right? That's sort of the lofty philosophical reason. The more pressing political reason is that right after World War II, this decolonialization process that really ramps up, this happens in the midst of the Cold War, right? It happens in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is exporting their version of socialism. They are engaged in a very aggressive kind of colonialism themselves. They are finding places around the world to export their political and economic system. And so there's a race during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union for political influence in these former colonial places around the world, right? This is where the term third world country comes from. If you've ever heard that phrase. The United States was the first world, the Soviet Union was the second world, and the undeclared people around the world, well, they were the third world, right? And the third world countries, which maps onto a lot of the undeveloped countries in the middle part of the 20th century, the former colonies, these places are up for grabs. And there's this real fear on the part of the United States and the powers of Europe that if we don't install liberal democracies in these colonies, liberal democracies and forms of government that are friendly to Western interests, well, the Soviet Union is going to come in there and they're going to set up a little communist nation, and they're now going to be very hostile to Western influence, right? So the decolonialization process throughout the world consists of, again, these often, these colonial powers in the past have been, in many cases, very brutal and punishing and authoritarian to the colonial people. them sort of backing out and saying, okay, well, we're going to go home now, we're cool, but we're friends, and you're going to form a kind of government that's in our best interest, right? So among that means, again, forming democratic nations that have that emphasize individual rights. This process of decolonialization famously has some hitches. It has some problems. And what we're going to talk about today, it has problems in various places throughout the world. Again, colonialism was a worldwide phenomenon. It was said for centuries that the sun never sets on the English Empire, meaning the English Empire had colonies all over the world, right? And so it meets with various problems. What we're going to talk about today is Claude Ake discussing the particular problems that Western liberalism has met with in Africa, in what he calls the African context. What we see, this decolonialization process, as I said, happens throughout Africa as well, and we see problems. We see the former colonial nations going through these various steps that the colonial powers pull out, that there is a liberal democratic form of government installed. That liberal democratic form of government proves to be too weak to survive. And very quickly, the people in these former colonies begin to revert back to tribal identifications and to tribal feuds. They begin to identify not with the weak national government, but rather with the principles and personalities of their own tribe. And this often turns into very, very bloody conflicts that the national government has no power to stop, right? And so these nations descend into various levels of civil war. Out of these civil wars, very often what arises is an authoritarian power, some warlord who is capable of really cracking down and bringing his people out of what Hobbes would call the state of nature, right? So that's the process by which, very Hobbesian process, these democratic nations in the African context prove to be too weak. They plunge the nation into civil war, and out of the civil war arises an authoritarian dictator, a warlord who is capable of wielding absolute power. And that's how we go that's in the African context, that's how we start out with a liberal democracy and end up with a warlord in charge, right? So why does this happen? Well, Ake is writing in the 80s. He's writing decades after the decolonialization has started, and this has happened time and again in Africa. And he talks about how Africa is in this state of what he calls permanent crisis. That everywhere you look throughout the African continent, there are failed nations. There are warlords killing people. There are people suffering because they can't get food, because they're very poor. The countries are just failing one after the other, right? And what do we make of this? Well, one way we might look at this, the way that a lot of people in the West, a lot of white people in the West are looking at this in Ake's time is, they just shake their head sadly and say, well, those Africans, man, they just can't get their thing together. They just can't get their crap together, right? And they just want to kill each other. See, you give them the Bill of Rights. You give them the Bill of Rights, and they just throw it aside, and they just want to kill each other and revert back to their tribal identifications, right? And Akay, of course, doesn't. As a native Nigerian, he thinks that this isn't the answer to the problem. It's not that Africans are different. It's not that they're too stupid to understand democracy. It's not that they're too barbaric to be civilized. He has some other ideas. So let's talk about what he thinks the problem is with the idea of human rights in Africa. First of all, Akay points out that you have a very different kind of people in Africa than you do in the 20th century, than you do with the nations of the West in the 20th century. People in the West are raised with these political values that emphasize our individualism. They emphasize our individual attitudes. They emphasize our individual rights and our individual consciousness. They emphasize this in a certain way, in a way that's inspired by the theories of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes and Locke assumed, well, Hobbes especially, assumed that the most basic human relationship that we have, the most natural human relationship that we have, is one of competition and conflict. Hobbes thinks that we want everything for ourselves, and we will take as much of it as we can, and we'll kill the first person who gets in our way. And that what we need more than anything is somebody to restrain us from this natural impulse to take everything for me, right? Hobbes again inspires Locke, and Locke inspires the United States. So the fingerprint, even if we're not Hobbesian in our political systems now, his fingerprints, the sort of smell of Hobbes, and his lone individualistic person wandering the ancient forests of the world, who only begrudgingly comes together to form into societies. That is this kind of birthplace of Western liberalism. And Akay thinks that this, it's like, stop right there, stop right from the first step. Akay thinks that makes no sense to people who are to the people in Africa who are raised in a tribal context. People in Africa or anywhere else where there is an emphasis on tribal associations, and there's an emphasis on the group, right? People out in especially in rural Africa, raised away from the cities, they're raised in a little tribe or a community. They're born into it from the moment they come into the world. The sense of individualism and individual rights and individual expression is something that comes later. It's not the first step. It's not the first attitude that he says Africans have. The first value that they encounter in their lives is cooperation. That people need to get along. That you need to do your part for your community. And this is a matter of life and death in the African context, Akay says. That people understand from the moment that they enter the world that they need to get along with people because they need the community. The alternative is to go out and die in the forest, right? Which is not, which is death, right? And it's not the way to go, right? And so when you're brought up with that attitude, raised with that attitude, Akay thinks that it's harder to understand why we would have, as one of our most fundamental political values, this emphasis on the individual rather than the emphasis on maybe the group and the rights of the group and thinking about what's good for the tribe, right? Furthermore, Akay thinks that that's the first problem, is that Africans, he says, are too aware of cooperation. That cooperation is their most basic value, and that Western liberalism emphasizes conflict and competition. The whole idea of human rights presupposes I am going to need rights, certain kinds of rights to protect me from other people and the government, right? And Akay thinks that's a bizarre. He thinks from an African perspective, that's kind of a bizarre place to begin your discussion of how to form a society that everybody's out to get you, right? Furthermore, Akay points out that the particular emphasis of Western liberalism, the kinds of policies and laws that it emphasizes, result in rights that are too abstract for average Africans. Abstract meaning something that you can't really touch. Abstract in philosophy is the opposite of concrete. Something that's concrete is something that you can touch and put your fingers on. Like this marker, I can touch it. I'm doing it now. That's in contrast to an abstract, something that's abstract, like the number 2. Where is the number 2? Or the concept of beauty, or the concept of justice. These are abstract concepts. You can't really, you can't really touch them or put your hands on them, right? So, Akay says that there are a lot of rights that are very important to Westerners that are too abstract when it comes to Africa. And what does he mean by this? Well, he means that there are a lot of rights that we emphasize that average people, especially in Africa, where there are a lot of very, very poor people. There are a lot of people who don't read or write the national language anyway. They're protected by certain kinds of rights, but the protection that these rights offer them is not anything that changes their day-to-day life or improves their day-to-day life. So take, for instance, the freedom of the press. This is a fundamental core value in the nations of the West and the United States in particular, that we can print off and make up a little newspaper and then say whatever we want. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Akay points out, well, now wait a second. Freedom of the press is so important to Western liberals, and he doesn't have any problem with liberals in the West wanting freedom of the press. But he points out that you can't, in the African context, whose life is made better by freedom of the press. If you're a poor, illiterate African out in the countryside somewhere, and every day you're worried that where your next meal is going to come from, you're worried that your crops are dying, you're worried that your child is going to die of curable diseases, of malaria, right? The idea that you could go to the city and start up a newspaper is not something is not a right that you're ever going to be in a position to realize. And as Akay points out, who is that right for? Well, it's for the people who have the wherewithal and the means to go and start up a newspaper. In other words, the rich people, the rich, well-educated people on the upper side of society. And it's an interesting question. Well, why do they need protection? Why do they need their individual rights to be so jealously protected? They already have. They're already in power. They're already politically important, right? So not only do these rights not really matter to average Africans, Akay says, but also they are in some cases the way these rights are emphasized even makes people suspicious that this system is not set up to improve the lives of the average people. It's set up to protect the powers that are already in place, right? Furthermore, Akay says that a third reason why Western liberal democracy and human rights are not flowering throughout Africa is that Akay thinks that the system maybe doesn't even make sense. He points out that the two core values in Western liberalism are liberty and equality, right? And he thinks that, well, Western liberals take it for granted that that freedom and equality are the most important political values, but maybe they're mutually exclusive, right? Maybe they don't even play well together. And if it's true that liberty and equality don't play well together, and that even people in the West can't really make sense of how it is we're supposed to negotiate having a certain amount of liberty versus a certain amount of equality, well, then how can we expect people to whom these values don't make a lot of intuitive sense, how can we expect them to make sense of how to have a nice balance of liberty and equality? So now let's talk about that. Let's talk about the problems of liberty and freedom and equality. But before we do that, let's get to these notes. So here are the problems with human rights in Africa. Here's the bullet points. Africans emphasize cooperation. Human rights presupposes conflict. That Western rights are too abstract, that is to say, only a few people are in position to realize them, and that Western values are in conflict in what Akay and others call the paradox of democracy. Right? So, now let's talk about the paradox of democracy. Akay writes that Western liberal democracy emphasizes liberty and equality as our most basic values, but liberty and equality actually don't play well with each other. Akay says they actually they exist in a kind of contradiction or a paradox, such that the more you have of one, the more freedom you have in a society, the less equality you have. And the more equality you have in a society, the less freedom you have. Now, can you think of, with regard to what is it true that the more freedom you have, the less equality you have, and vice versa? Can you think of it? Yes, that's right. It's with regard to wealth in particular, that the more freedom we have to keep the money that we earn for ourselves, the more there are going to be wealthy and poor people, and politically powerful people and politically disenfranchised people in our society. The more, however, we come along and we take away wealth to redistribute it to people, and the more equality we have, the less freedom we're going to have to keep the money that we earn, right? And Akay thinks, well, it's real simple. I mean, you just have to, if you're going to set up a democracy and you're going to set up, the kinds of laws that we have, you just have to pick a system. You have to have a system that politically picks a side, right? Okay, so you want both liberty and equality, but you can't have an equal measure of them. So pick which one, in a pinch, right? When they come into conflict with each other, which side are you going to favor, right? And Akay thinks it's very obvious which side the West has taken when it comes to conflicts between liberty and equality. It was clear in the 1980s anyway. Maybe a little less today with the nations of Europe anyway. But certainly here in the United States, I don't think there's any doubt about it, that it's clear which side we favor. Liberty, right? We favor keeping the money that you earn. And this is, by the way, this is not just some lofty philosopher's problem that nobody ever really thinks about or deals with. This is at the heart, this tension between what's good for me and what's good for the society generally. This tension is at the heart of every major political problem that we have in the United States. just off the top of my head, consider healthcare, right? We're in a major sort of we've run this long-term political battle over what we should do about the healthcare in the United States, right? And there is, on the one hand, this push to have some kind of healthcare plan for people who can't afford to have healthcare, so that people aren't dying because they're poor. That's one push. On the other hand, the people who are in the position of having to then pay or kick in to fund a national healthcare system, what are they saying? They're saying, hell no, I have healthcare, and you can't take away my money to redistribute it to people who I don't know and aren't my children and have nothing to do with me, right? And the other side says, yes, we can. You still live in a society. And the other side says, well, no, we're going to vote Republican. Sorry, I'm knocking the table and making the causing the camera to unfocus. But anyway, so but right there you have the very kind of conflict that that AK is talking about, that we are trying to navigate the on the one hand, our sense of being equal members of society, and one person not having any more sort of inherent value than another person. On the other hand, we are trying to navigate, well, what about me and my stuff and the stuff that I earn, and keeping it for myself, right? And it's very clear in the West. It's less, well, as I said, it's less clear, circa, 2020, where the nations of Europe have changed a little bit now. But in the United States, it's certainly clear that we just can't get past this concern that we have about my individual right to keep the money that I earn. Right, and AK thinks that, well, right there is a problem, or is going to be a problem with the West exporting this political system and these values to people in the African context, because AK says, with the different kind of consciousness that Africans have, their consciousness of their place in a community, not necessarily as an individual, but as a member of the community who wants the whole community to do better and succeed. If you're raised with that kind of consciousness, as opposed to our own individualistic consciousness here in the United States, where we want, first and foremost, what we can get for ourselves, and then we worry about what's good for the group, AK thinks, no, that's not going to, we're going to have, if Western human rights are going to work in Africa, we're going to have a system in Africa. They're going to have a system in Africa that is capable of favoring equality over liberty, right? Capable of putting the group's rights over individual rights. This, of course, AK doesn't quite come out and say this, but when he's writing, it's still in the midst of it's at the tail end of the Cold War in the mid-1980s. And this idea of making individual rights take a back seat to communal rights sounds an awful lot like communism to a lot of people who are in power in the Western nations around the world, and they just don't want to hear it, right? AK is saying things that are very unpopular. They're very unpopular internationally at this time, and they're very unpopular locally. We haven't talked about, just as a footnote here, the West, particularly the United States, during the Cold War, if they, they're often fighting to install regimes in these third world countries that are first and foremost favorable to the United States, and any other concern is secondary. So what we see in a lot of countries a lot of times in these third world countries, is that given a chance, once they decolonialize, given a chance to vote on who they want to be in charge, they will vote in people who are espousing a lot of the kinds of attitudes that AK is espousing here. These communal rights at the expense of individual rights that sound an awful lot like communism. And the United States has a terrible, terrible track record in the 20th century of destabilizing democratically elected leaders around the world, because they are they are emphasizing, they're giving speeches that appeal to a more communal, perhaps communist values than USA democracy and capitalism. And the truth of the matter is, the United States in the 20th century, given a choice between a brutal dictator who is anti-communist and partial to the United States on the one hand, or a democratically elected leader who maybe is thinking about some socialist reforms, United States again and again sides either politically or in more direct ways with establishing the dictator who is, with backing the dictator who is partial to the United States, right? That happens, and I mean, throughout the world, right? There are some famous examples in Chile and in Indonesia and in, well, Iran, right, of the United States sort of ousting democratically elected leaders to put thugs in charge, right? I mean, murderous, horrible people in charge, right? Just because they are partial to the United States, right? And Akay lives in such a country. In Nigeria, in the 80s, Nigeria is run by a military regime, and Akay saying these kinds of things is very dangerous, very hazardous to your health in a country run by the military in the 1980s. Actually, Akay, not in the 80s, but in 1996, is killed in a plane crash. The plane he's on explodes in midair, killing 180 people, him included. And the conventional wisdom in his home country of Nigeria is that the plane was blown up to kill him. So he may have paid the ultimate price, and 180 of his neighbors might have paid then the price too for him saying a lot of these unpopular things. So, okay. So the consequences. Talk about some of the consequences for the failures of democracy in Africa. That these liberal democratic systems are put in place by the former colonial powers. The governments are not powerful enough to survive. They're not strong enough to survive. Very quickly, they descend into chaos. There's civil war. The people end up being brutalized by various sort of warlords that arise out of the people, and this results in there being no development in Africa. There's in Africa there are all sorts of natural resources, from oil to diamond to just about every natural resource you can think of. Why aren't the African nations then, since they have all the natural resources, why aren't they the richest nations in the world? Well, one reason, not the only reason, maybe not even the most important reason, but one reason is that there fails to be any sort of infrastructure developed in a lot of these countries because they're going through these constant struggles with not having a good government in place and civil war and then killing each other and then brutal dictator. And then, rising up against the brutal dictator and kicking him out, and then civil war again. Right? There's no time in there to build oil derricks and to get the oil out of the ground. If you spend it all in go in this repeated cycle that Hobbes talks about of going through the state of nature. Right? So, what is the answer then? What do we do? Well, Akay has some suggestions. So I forgot to do the notes from that section. So the notes are as follows. We're talking about the paradox of democracy. The paradox of democracy points out that the central values of liberal democracy, liberty and equality, are in conflict. That the more liberty you have, the less equality you have, and vice versa. You have to pick which value you're going to favor. The West has favored liberty, But this solution doesn't work in the African context for some of the reasons we talked about before, that the idea of individual liberty just doesn't come as naturally or seem as fundamental to the African mind. Akay thinks. So, okay, now let's talk about what he thinks the solution is. Okay, so before we get into what Akay thinks is the answer to these problems, today's attendance password is Angel. So the attendance password is Angel. So let's talk about what. So Akay, that's the diagnosis. Akay thinks that's the problem. So what's the solution? Well, Akay thinks that we need to approach. We need to approach the African context with an understanding of the problems and the minds of the people who live in the land that we are trying to fix, right? And we need to understand that just because one version of our plan and our values works for white Europeans and their descendants does not necessarily mean that it is going to work for people who live in a different kind of land with different problems and a different consciousness. And we begin with the consciousness again. Akay thinks we need to understand that people who live in the African context just have a different mindset than people who are raised in relatively much wealthier, more individualistic societies. Again, people in the African context where every day you are struggling for survival, you're born into this system where every day of your life, from your first breaths, you are aware, immediately, tangibly aware of how it is that your actions affect the group and how the group's actions affect you. And that if you don't do your part, the group is going to suffer. In the same way that if the group doesn't succeed, you're going to die. That if we're raised in that kind of context, with that kind of attitude from when we're a very small child, we're going to have a very different attitude towards the world or a very different mindset about the world. And if we're going to come up with we're going to think about a kind of government that's going to work in the African context, it's going to have to be a government that's compatible with that different consciousness. So Akay thinks so that's sort of his loftier suggestion. His more nuts and bolts suggestions are that in the first case we're going to need, or rather, the second thing we're going to need, besides an understanding of consciousness, is we're going to need rights that you can sell to people in Africa, right? We're going to need a political system that the people in Africa, the rank and file Africans who are trying to get to back our political system, whose political support, whose consent we need to make a system work, we're going to have to come up with a system that they feel like they have a stake in. They feel like there's something in it for them to back this particular system. There's some way that this system makes their lives better. And Akay thinks you're not going to do that with the attitude towards rights that the West has. The attitude towards rights that the West has is that we're all naturally free and the government just needs to step back and just, let us be free. Let us trade to acquire things we want and so on, right? And just to stay out of our way. Akay thinks you can't just will that kind of system into existence in the African context. You have to understand. You have to sell to these people that there's something the government can offer them, and that means more than just staying out of their way. That means getting them things that they need, establishing certain kinds of not just freedoms from interference, but certain kinds of rights to food and water, clean water, and education and medicine and so on. Get them the things that they need that's going to change their life, improve their lives on a day-to-day basis. So we need concrete rather than just abstract rights. Don't start with freedom of the press, which nobody knows how to make that nobody there is going to, out in the backcountry of Nigeria knows how to realize that right. You have to go out there and tell them, hey, this government is going to give you, is going to establish a medical program. This government is going to establish a banking system that can, get you a loan for something that can improve your life, right? These are the kinds of day-to-day things that, if we emphasize those before anything, Kay thinks, that is the kind of thing that he thinks a lot of average Africans can really get behind. Finally, and maybe most controversially, he's been sort of dancing around this up until the very sort of last page. This is the most dangerous idea, particularly, in 1985 or, I think it's 88 when he's writing this, but still, this is a very dangerous idea. He thinks that we need to redistribute political and economic power in Africa. That means taking away stuff, wealth, political power from the people who currently have it and reinvesting it in the people. And this is not a popular idea in Nigeria or most other places throughout Africa and around the world at this time, right? You're going to just take the power back and give it to the people. You're going to take the wealth back and give it to the people. Let's talk about where the wealth is for a second in Africa in the 1980s, and in many cases still today. As I said before, Africa is the most resource-rich continent on the planet. Why aren't African nations then the richest nations on the planet? Well, go back to colonialism and the process of decolonialization, right? Back during colonial times, all of the wealth of Africa redounded in the benefit of white European colonial powers. So all the gold in our hills, all the wood, all the oil that they find throughout sub-Saharan Africa and other places, that's all to the benefit of the king. And if not the king, then the other powers, the nobles of Europe, right? So you would think, if you were really naive, you would think that when they decolonialized, when Belgium pulled out of Rwanda, and they gave up their political stake in Rwanda, well, didn't they also give up their diamond mines there? No, they didn't. I mean, it's one thing for the Belgian government to leave. It's another thing for the De Beers mining company to leave. No, of course not. The international conglomerates that own all the stuff in Africa, they're not going anywhere. And so, the diamonds and the oil and all the other stuff that comes out of Africa, it lives in Africa, but when it comes up out of the ground, well, it goes to the benefit of some corporation in some far, far, far away land. And so when Akay talks about redistributing political and economic power, he's not just talking about taking the political power back from the local warlord. He's also talking about perhaps taking back the diamond mines from De Beers, right? And that in particular, it's one thing to court disaster with your local warlord. It's something quite else to begin to question the international order of things with some, multi-billion-dollar capitalist country. Akay is suggesting things that are politically very dangerous, and maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but certainly not a popular thing to be talking about with regard to the powers that be, anyway. So, okay, so these are the notes for this section. So, what do we need to fix things as they are in Africa? So, we need an African conception of human rights. This is a system of human rights that understands the different consciousness between the West and Africans. The system is going to emphasize concrete rights, not abstract rights. It's going to emphasize group rights as opposed to individual rights too. That might be another bullet point. This is going to mean a redistribution of political and economic power from the way that it is in these various countries in circa 1988. The sort of ominous background of this article is that this state of permanent crisis that Ake talks about in 1988, it's largely still going on. This article was written in 1998. It could have been written yesterday. A lot of these same. I think Africa is actually going through as a continent is going through a relative period of relative peace right now. Just a few years ago, there was the major crisis in Sudan, for instance. That was just this ongoing, decades-long the kind of political crisis that Ake is talking about. This ongoing sort of decades-long slaughter of the average people by these competing warlord factions, right? Interestingly, perhaps one of the things that has begun to, maybe sadly, one of the things that is perhaps, I'm just editorializing now, one of the things that perhaps is leading to a period of relative peace right now in Africa is that there have been more and more Chinese international businesses, particularly with regard to oil, moving in to open up shop in Africa, and so maybe the source of the period of relative peace is another form of economic colonialism from another direction, right? The Chinese direction. So, which would be sad. Okay, so that is the Ake article for today. So, okay, if you have any questions, email them to me or start up a thread on the discussion board. So I will see you next time.